I continue to pray also for Cody and Mallory. They're down in Tennessee on vacation. Kind of interesting. I guess was that Saturday, Wayne? Saturday when their car broke down? Was that Saturday? Their car broke down. Thankfully, it was across the street from the mechanic. So all we had to do is just have Wayne come out and pull it across the street for us. And so took care of that. And on Tuesday, yesterday, they were able to get it fixed. And so I'm driving his car around. They just took my car on vacation. So I'm the one that got the dirty end of the stick, just for the record. All right, I'm the one that took a beating on it. So I had to pay for his car. What's up with that? You know what I'm saying? Just I'll get the money back. But it's just for the time being. Anyway, verse 19, chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, verse 19. Now, we've already talked about a lot of things during the book of Philippians, man, how much they rejoiced in their fellowship together, the humility that they expect from each and every one of us, and talks about how the humility of Jesus Christ and how we actually are to use Him as the idea of our humility. When we look at how much humility it took for Him to leave heaven, come to earth, die for our sins, and that's just an amazing thing. And so when we look at that, it's kind of embarrassing at times when I think, how humble God wants us to be and how arrogant I can be at times. How much I want my way and how much I want things to be just the way I want them to be. And sometimes, we just have to stop and say, God, I'm sorry, and seek forgiveness for that. But we're going to pick up in verse 19. Verse 19, here's what we kind of pick up. He lets them know that, listen, He cares about them and all of those kinds of things. He's already expressed that. And so he's going to send Timothy back to the church of Philippi. Keep in mind, he now is in Rome in prison. That's where the letter's written from. Timothy is there with him at this particular time. And he tells him, I'm going to send Timothy back. All right? And so in verse 19, he says, but I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timotheus shortly unto you, that I also may be of good comfort when I know your state. Now, as we saw back in chapter 1 and verse 1, Timothy was with Paul in Rome while he's in prison. So we know Timothy's with him there. And Paul is apparently in prayer and trusting that God will give him peace about sending Timothy back there. He knows that, listen, I need to send Timothy back there. Timothy needs to go there, help them understand some things, instruct them some things, teach them some things. And even though Timothy's a young man, he apparently is very knowledgeable and has great wisdom, in regard to Scriptures. He's been traveling with Paul. Paul is his mentor. He's taught him well. So he's got a lot of confidence in Timothy, as we'll see here in a few moments. And so what happens is he's going to send Timothy back, but he's not ready to send him back just yet. He wants to make sure that the timing is what it ought to be. I mean, for now, Timothy is his right-hand man, and so while he's in prison, he's probably thankful that Timothy's there with him and glad that Timothy is on board with him and taking care of some of the things that need to be taken care of. So he realizes he needs to send Timothy back. He said, I'm praying about it. I want it to be God's leadership. I want to feel confident that that's what God wants to do. I don't know about you, but I'm like that. Boy, when it's something I want really bad, and God seems to be leading somewhere else, man, I got to tell you, I pray hard because I want to be really confident because I kind of like the situation the way it is, And so, God, you got to hit me over the head and make sure I get this. And that's kind of where Paul's at. He's like, I'm waiting for God to just really make it known to me without a shadow of a doubt that I need to send Timothy back. He said, I want to feel comfortable in doing that. And we know that Timothy did not go back at the time that this letter was sent to him. Had he sent Timothy back at this particular time, he could have just sent the letter with him. Remember, when we're reading these things, this is a letter that was sent. Now, these things, it's not like today. I know that we get this idea that things just happen like that, but they don't. I mean, today we can shoot them an email, But when you look back at this situation, what you find is, sometimes it was months, usually weeks, but sometimes it was months before they got a letter that they were sending to them. So, it was a big deal. Keep in mind, from Ephesus, from Philippi to Rome is a long, long journey. And if you don't remember, when Paul went to Rome, you remember all he went through in getting there, where he had to cross over the Mediterranean Sea, and they crossed over at a time of year that was not a good time, and the boat wound up in a storm, and they had to dock. The boat crashed, and they had to dock somewhere for a while, get on another boat, and go on over to Rome. It was forever before they wound up getting to Rome. So when he wrote this letter back to Philippi, there's no way of knowing really how long it took for them to get that letter back to Philippi. And so he's saying, listen, I'm going to send Timothy, but until that happens, he's not the one going to be delivering this letter. So they knew that because he didn't come with the letter. All right? So he's just knowing that, listen, God's going to send Timothy back. It's just a matter of when. Now, we also discussed in the introduction of this letter that Timothy was a part of the team that was present when the church of Philippi had begun, when it was first formed. When Lydia got saved and they began to have services in her house, and when the Philippian jailer got saved. Timothy was actually there and was a part of that crew when all of these things began to form. And so I say that because when he says, I'm going to send Timothy to you, that's important to them because this is somebody they know. This is somebody they've got confidence in. They've seen Timothy work. They've probably seen him out door to door with Paul and sitting and studying and heard him teach. And so they knew who Timothy was. And so he's saying, listen, I'm going to send Timothy back. So he was someone they could have confidence in, someone they personally knew. He wasn't just somebody that had gotten saved along the way that Paul mentored that they had never met. But this is someone they knew. He was a friend. And then lastly, he was not yet ready to send Timothy at the time he delivered this letter. But in so doing, he's just letting them know, listen, I care about you enough. I'm going to send you my right-hand guy. I'd like to keep him with me, but I'm going to send him to you because that's how much he cared for the church of Philippi. All right? So in verse 19, he basically just let them know that, listen, he's going to send Timothy, and they can look for his coming. And he wanted to know their state. That is, I'm anxious to find out, what's going on in the church. I mean, from one time where he's able to get maybe some correspondence, we'll talk about that in a second because, what's his name, Epaphroditus, am I saying that correct? We'll be talking about him in a little bit. And he had come from the church of Philippi, and in so doing, he brought them word about how it was going on in the church and how things are happening. So it's neat to find those things out, and he just wants to know if things are still going well. All right? I know I've only had the opportunity to visit a handful of our missionaries or church planters on the field. And, we get them in here, and they tell us what they're going to do and tell us how they're going to do it, and they go out on the field, and we get letters every month, and we read the letters, and we kind of know what's going on, sort of, but we don't know either. It's not like being there. And it's pretty exciting when you have the opportunity to get on the field and look and see what they're doing. And it gives you a whole new respect for that individual or for the field that they're on and understand and know what has to be done. And I just really appreciated the opportunity to do those things. Now, in doing that, it was good to know what was happening in their life in that regard. It made, when they say, hey, will you pray for me about this? Do you remember Sister So-and-so when you were here? Well, she's not doing real well. Yeah, I can put a face to it. I know who they are. I've prayed for them in person. And there's it just makes it different. And so this is what's going on here. And so he's letting them know, listen, Timothy's coming to see you. And I'm sending him because I kind of am concerned about the state you're in as well. His hopes were, if you remember, that he would eventually get out of jail and go too. And that's part of the reason he might be hanging on to Timothy also, because he's got a hearing coming up, and he's hoping that that hearing is going to work in his favor. He doesn't know if it's going to or not, but he's hoping it might. And if it does, it gives him an opportunity to go back with Timothy. And I think that seems to be his goal. That seems to be what he's waiting on. So once he finds out what they're going to do, whether they're going to keep him in jail or let him go, then he'll know what to do with Timothy, once that's handed down. That's what it seems. And so that's what he seems to be waiting on. So once that happens, he can say, okay, I'm stuck here in jail, which is what happens. And I'm going to go ahead and send Timothy on because somebody needs to go. All right. Verse 20, for I have no man like-minded who will naturally care for your state. Paul had such incredible confidence in Timothy, and he knew that there was no other person that was as like-minded as he was. He knew Timothy loved the church of Philippi, as he did, and that he would care for their needs in the same manner that he would care for their needs if he was there. He felt confident of that. He knew that it was Timothy's nature to care for the church of Philippi in such a way as to put his own needs aside and provide for the needs of the church. There are some interesting things about that if you just kind of stop and think about it. Because when he talks about Timothy being like-minded, there's no indication that Timothy had a wife. And we know that Paul did not have a wife. It could be that Timothy had made the same commitments that Paul had made in regard to, listen, I'm just going to do the work and I'm going to try my best to do that. And I think I can do that without being burdened to have a wife. And as long as that can happen, more power to him. And in so doing, it gives him more flexibility, more availability, more opportunity to do the work of the church. He could go as he needed to go. The Bible tells us clearly it's good to have a wife, and there's nothing wrong with having a wife. But if you do, then you need to meet her needs. And so what happens is then it obligates you then to meet the needs of your family, which is the right thing to do. But it also restricts you from being able to just have the freedom to always be out and always be gone and always be doing, because you need to be at home with your wife occasionally as well. And so when he says they're like-minded, I get the idea that they've made some of the very same decisions in life as well. And so he knows that, listen, Timothy's got the freedom to come there, do whatever needs to be done, serve as he needs to serve, without anything that hinders him from doing that. And so I think that's kind of the picture. So when he says that they are like-minded, I think that has a lot to do with that. And in so doing, it also tells him that Timothy has this natural built-in desire to meet the needs of the people of the church, or to meet the needs of folks of Christ. And in so doing, he says, listen, it just seems to come natural with him. It's just one of those things. And he has not forsaken me. He stayed right here with me. No matter how difficult the times have gotten, no matter how tough things are, it seems like Timothy is always right there. He never forsakes me. He's always right there. Now, he says that because, let's face it, there were some that at some point in time had turned on him. When you farther down the line, it's after these things are taking place. But in 2 Timothy 4:10, he tells us, for Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica, Crescens to Galatia, Titus unto Dalmatia. So he's saying there's a bunch of them that have left for one reason or another. And not always a bad reason, but by the same token, he says it almost as though, even though some of them may have left for a good cause, he wasn't convinced it was time for him to go. That seems to be the impression. And so in the case of Demas, we know that he left because he says he loved the present world. He said he loved the things of the world more than doing the work of God. So, it was something that he had made a conscious decision to do that. Now, like I said, those are likely after the writing of the rights here, but by the same token, I would imagine that tells us that there was probably others that from time to time did the same thing. I mean, we all know, obviously, of John Mark, and that was right at the beginning of the ministry when he was still with Barnabas on his journey. So we know that he has experienced guys that didn't stay the course. And so he says that. He says, listen, there are some that, have not been this way. And nobody has been as like-minded as Timothy. And so Timothy has stayed the course, and I'm going to send Timothy to you, and you know him, and you know his heart, and you know what he does. In verse 21, for all seek their own, not the things which are Christ's. It's a problem for Paul that many focus on their own concerns rather than the concerns of Christ. I'm going to tell you this. I would imagine I don't know if this is a guess or not, but I'm just going to say it regardless. Paul would be a tough guy to work with. I have this feeling that, man, that dude expected you to really stay the course throughout anything and everything, and to put any of your own desires, period, on the back, And the forefront would be, the things that he believed that God would have him to be doing and serving and doing. And so there were some of those guys that was probably a real challenge for them. And when you're talking about a guy like Paul, things that might be a real challenge for them, and they think they're really stepping up, but Paul's going, these guys just love the world too much. I just can't get them to be committed to Christ. They just love the world too much. It's kind of funny like that, but all of us do that to some degree probably. I mean, there are folks that I think, man, they could just do so much more. They could just do so much more. Now, I don't know your private life, so obviously I don't know, but I can't help but to feel that way sometimes, And I feel like, well, man, that person should be doing more, should be, using their gifts more, should be expressing themselves, should be more faithful to this or that. And we're all kind of guilty of doing that. But what he's doing here is he's not necessarily saying that, listen, Timothy is the only guy doing anything. It's not what he's saying. He's using that as a comparison. In light of what Timothy's doing, you would think that nobody else is doing anything because he's doing so much. The Bible uses that kind of a comparison quite a bit. In fact, you see Jesus using that kind of a comparison. I mean, we see him talking about you can't be my disciple unless you hate your mom, hate your father, and he starts naming all that. And he doesn't mean you literally hate them, but by comparison, we need to love God and love what he would have us to do more, so much more, that it would be to that degree, that it would seem as though we didn't love the others. And so that's the picture that I think he's doing. I think he's just drawing a comparison. And he's not saying there was, that there was none that followed Christ. But he's saying, listen, for all seek their own and not the things which are Jesus Christ. All of us, and this is what he's saying, all of us are guilty of this to some degree. All of us. There are times where I choose to do what I want to do rather than what I know God would have me to do. Whether it's in the way I spend my time, whether it's in the way I spend my money, whether it's in the way I care or love someone else or their needs, whether it's, just my service to Christ and what he would have me to do in my ministry. Whatever it might be, there are times where I put too much I put too much of my desires ahead of that of Christ. And so this is basically what he's saying. Listen, he's saying Timothy's kind of an exception, but by and large, he's saying people devote more time to themselves than they do to Christ. And just the way it is. And so just by comparison, that happens. Let me give you an example too. Just having a wife and children would obviously force us to have to divide our time because we don't want to neglect those responsibilities. And God tells us to that those are our obligations and our responsibilities, so we want to take care of them. Or like Peter, James, and John, they also had business obligations that they let go eventually, but it took them a while before they really kind of got to the place where they were willing to just let them go. And so until that time, they had to tend to them. Peter was married, so he had an obligation to care for his wife, had apparently a sickly mother-in-law he had to care for on occasion. And John had the obligation of caring for the mother of Jesus, Mary. And so, all of them had some obligations that they had to divide some bit of time to. And so when you look at this picture, it could possibly be that he was not being derogatory at all. He was just basically saying that, listen, we have responsibilities in life that are not bad responsibilities, that also force us to have to devote time and attention to those things and to try to not neglect the things of God also. And that's understandable. I mean, most people have to have a job, provide for your family, provide for your needs. We get that. I mean, we can't very well just go through life without a job. We wouldn't get much done. We wouldn't be able to accomplish much. We would not be caring for our families like we should. And so that's an obligation. There are also, beyond that, there are needs for our family, spending time with them and attention, and all those things are important. And so, when we look at this whole picture, there are times where we're in a position to where we're forced to have to care for those things. God doesn't condemn that, but He does expect us to not neglect either of those things. And so we don't want to use one as an excuse to neglect the other. And so it's important. I'll just tell you now, I've known pastors who have lost their families because they devoted so much time and attention to the church that they neglected their family. You can't do that. You have to know and you have to understand how to spend time with both and how not to neglect either. And it's important to do that. I mean, you never want your family to think that you put the church ahead of them, because putting God first, means putting my family and the church in a proper perspective. And that's how you put God first, and make sure you understand that. And by the way, the family came before the church. So there is an obligation to those things. And so we have to be sure and give the attention to that. 1 Corinthians 7:7 is kind of an interesting verse. I alluded to it a moment ago. He says, But I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of good for them. I skipped a line. Let me go all the way back. For I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. So he's saying, listen, it's good if you're unmarried, just stay unmarried. He goes on to tell you that if you burn to get married, and that simply means that if your desire is so great to have someone, a companion, a wife, then you need to get married. But he's saying that if you can sustain, if you can not have that family to attend to, you can devote that other time without having to divide that time. And so he's saying if you can stay like that, more power to you, and you should. But if it's going to cause you to think bad things, or if it's going to cause you to continually lust after this or lust after that, then by all means get married. All right? So that's the picture. So he's just saying, listen, it's a difficult challenge. And he says, I get it. But he says, but Timothy made the same decisions I made. And so Timothy is one of those guys that can devote his whole time to you and dedicate that time to you. Verse 22 says, But ye know the proof of him, that as a son with the Father he hath served with me in the gospel. Again, all that's saying is, listen, you guys know Timothy. You know who he is. You know what he's done. They knew the relationship between Timothy and Paul. They had witnessed him in ministry. And they weren't merely just taking Paul's word for it. They knew Timothy. And so he's just essentially saying, listen, you've witnessed for yourself his testimony. All right? You've witnessed it. You know it. And so you know what has taken place. And then verse 23 and 24, I'm going to do those together. Verse 23 says, Him therefore I hope to send presently, so soon as I shall see how it will go with me. So he's saying, I'm going to send him as soon as I know how it's going to go with me. And my assumption is go with me is in relation to how the courts are going to decide. All right? And so he says, But I trust in the Lord that I also myself shall come shortly. So he's saying, here's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that they'll release me. And I'm hoping that he and I both will get to make the trip. All right? That's my desire. Now, we know that doesn't happen. There are some people that believe it did, but I do not. But regardless, it doesn't seem as though it happened. And it seems that he is just waiting for this verdict, and waiting for the verdict to be handed down. All right? And when that happens, and he's going to send Timothy as soon as possible, then verse 25, he says, Yet I supposed it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, and companion in labor and fellow soldier, but your messenger, and he that ministereth to my wants. This is an interesting thing, because what has happened is Epaphroditus came from the church of Philippi. Church of Philippi, we already talked about this, how great they were to Paul. They continually sent goods to him. They sent things that he needed. Well, they also sent someone within their church that they felt like was one of their key guys, like one of their best men. It would be like if we sent, let's say we sent Cody, to help some church. And it would be like that. It was on that level. And so they sent Epaphroditus to Rome to help Paul. All right? And so Epaphroditus' job was to take all the stuff that they had given him and to deliver it to Paul, but then stay with Paul for a while, help meet whatever needs he had. It didn't matter what they were. Provide for his care, do anything that he needed. They just wanted him to be there with Paul. Now, I'm one of those guys that always thinks there's probably a story behind the story. And this is what I think. I think the story behind the story is it was also a good opportunity for them to take their key guy, send him down there, and sit under Paul's teachings for a while and come back with some really incredible stuff. Come back is full of wisdom, understanding, knowledge. And so that's the impression I get, at least. But regardless, what we find is Epaphroditus, as I said, he was a native of Philippi and probably a part of that church. And when he delivered these gifts, the problem is on his way, he got sick. I mean, sick to the point that they thought he was going to die. We'll talk about that in a second, but that plays into this. In Philippians 4:18 says this, "But I have all and abound. I am full, having received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you, an odor of a sweet smell, a sacrifice acceptable, well-pleasing to God." So though it was Paul's desire to go back himself, and though it was Paul's desire to send Timothy back, instead, he puts this letter in the hands of Epaphroditus and says, listen, take this back to your church and read the letter, and let them read this letter. All right? But in this letter, he lets them know what he thinks of Epaphroditus. He lets them know that, hey, listen, number one, I really appreciate you guys. He's saying, listen, you sent me everything I could have possibly wanted. And he says, it's amazing at what you sent. He talks about, all the things that were good for him, the things that he had received. He says that he abounds. It was wonderful, all the stuff. But then he talks about Epaphroditus. And he wants to let him know that, listen, you chose a good guy. Man, you sent a guy that really loves the Lord. And look at some of the things he calls him. He calls him his companion in labor, which means he worked with Paul in sharing the gospel and teaching others about Christ. They likely, in all likelihood, had prayed together, studied together, shared Christ together. And I got to tell you, these kind of guys are hard to find. They really are. You look at churches that are even far bigger than ours, that have only a handful of guys within the church that, are guys like this, that are really devoted and committed to what God would have them to do, willing to maybe go on a mission field or go pastor a church or, to be faithful in the ministries of the church or whatever. And he's saying this guy was a real companion. If there was things to do, he was with me. That's what a companion is. If there was any labor to be done, he was right there, and he was always with me and helping. So you sent a really good guy. And then he also calls him a fellow soldier. I like that picture because as a pastor, let me tell you how much I like that, because as a pastor, you fight a lot of spiritual battles that maybe a lot of people don't even know you're fighting, because you can't let them know. You have to move on, and so many times when you're fighting a spiritual battle, you're fighting it all by yourself, it seems like. But regardless, there are times in your life where, the spiritual battles seem to sometimes just be overwhelming. And it's like when you think this is going, and that's exciting, that's happening, and all of a sudden over here, this falls apart. And it's like, can't we just get it all on the same page? We just move forward. And it's always a battle, continually a battle. And when in those battles, what you need is that guy that just kind of senses that and comes along, puts his arm around you and prays with you. Just let you know, listen, I'm praying for you and I love you. You need me for anything, let me know. You need those kinds of guys. And so what he's saying is, listen, in these spiritual battles that we face, how good it is to know that I've got somebody that's going to stand with me in that battle. And he's saying Epaphroditus is one of those guys. I would trust him in that battle. And then he says he's your messenger, your representative, your ambassador. He is someone who represents you. And I'm going to tell you, if he's a representation of you, I'm thinking highly of you all because he's a good guy. He's your messenger. So everything you wanted me to know, this guy has been faithful to share those things. Then he says, he that ministered to my wants. Man, I mean, he just goes on and on about all that he has done and all that he has took part in. And so it says he has ministered to my wants. He was faithful to meet whatever need Paul had. You know, Paul's sitting there going, man, I wish I had a taco. And next thing he knows, he's got a taco. You know what I'm saying? It's one of those deals where if there's a need, man, this guy's going to meet that need. And Paul being in prison, you know, even though at this particular time it seems like he had a lot of leniency, probably had a lot of freedom, but at the same, and that's probably why he thought he would be able to have the freedom to leave. But he had a lot of freedom. And yet, even in that, there were things that he could not do, could not get out to do, and Epaphroditus was quick to do them. So he says, listen, you sent a great guy. You sent a guy that can get the job done. And then verse 26, where he longed after you all and was full of heaviness because that ye had heard that he had been sick. Now that's key, because in verse 27 he says, for indeed he was sick nigh unto death. So we know Epaphroditus en route there got some kind of sickness and about died. They expected him to die. And he knew that word had gotten back to Philippi that was the case. And, you know, as slow as the mail would run, you know, as slow as it was to get information and get news, there was a lot of heaviness on the part of the Philippians. And so I'm sure they were really concerned, did Epaphroditus die? Is he dead? Is he alive? We don't even know. We just know the last word we got was he was sick and they were expecting him to die. So they probably thought he had likely died. And so they were heavy-hearted. Well, Epaphroditus knew they had heard. And he's like, man, it's not like I can just pick up my phone and call them. It takes months for me to let them know that I'm not dead. In fact, the news that he wasn't dead came from him delivering the letter, you know. And so, you know, can you imagine them? See him come strolling in. Hey, guys, you know. But that's the picture. And so he was tore up because he knew the people back home, family, church, whoever, friends, all of them probably thought he died. And that was really bothering him. And he was really struggling with the fact that he knew that's what they would be thinking. So he was really concerned about that. Paul was concerned about that and was anxious to send him back so they would know that he was well. And send him back with a good report so they knew that, listen, not only is he well, but man, he has served well here. And so that's a big deal. By the way, we see that same heart in Jesus. You remember with Mary and Martha, when Lazarus died, Jesus knew he was going to resurrect Lazarus. But just because he could see the pain and the hurt that Mary and Martha experienced, we find that real short little verse, Jesus wept. And so that's the picture. And I'm going to stop there, and we'll say a little bit more about that when we pick up in verse 27, because it still talks about that some. All right? Any questions about anything we discussed tonight? Anything that didn't make any sense to you? Okay. All right. That's good, because I might not be able to make sense of it. You never know. All right. Super. Glad you guys came out tonight. Appreciate all of you. Scotty, if you don't mind, will you dismiss us, please?